My guest today is Stephanie Robertson, who is the founding president of Simpex Strategy Group Incorporated, a specialized agency working with private, public, and nonprofit agencies seeking to understand, manage, and measure their social impact. A key aspect of this work is the establishment of governance systems to guide and to monitor all aspects of the social impact. Stephanie was first credited as a social return on investment practitioner in North America. She was the founding partner, and I think I've got this right, CIROC Canada?
Oh, SROI Canada.
SROI Canada.
Yep.
Stephanie has developed and delivered training programs for more than 100 community projects and agencies. She resided in London, England from 1997 to 2004. She's an MBA graduate of the London Business School. She worked as a corporate and social responsibility consultant with corporate citizenship companies providing strategic guidance to British and international firms seeking to enhance their community investment and corporate social responsibility programming. Stephanie is the recipient of numerous awards from the London Business School, including the European Case Clearinghouse Award in 2006 and 2007. In 1999, she was awarded the London Business School Alumni Association's Outstanding Contribution to the School, and in 1995, she was the recipient of the United Nations Global Citizen Award presented by the United Nations Secretary General. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
So share with us what social return on investment is all about.
The social return on investment it's a methodology. It's essentially a framework that you put information within. And essentially what you're trying to do is demonstrate that there has been a change that's happened as a result of an investment. So you're measuring that change, and then you're valuing that change in financial terms. Oftentimes what you need to do is to use something called a financial proxy to represent that value, the value of that change. Because in a social context, there's still a lot of debate about the value of enabling a person to overcome barriers in order to move into permanent employment, or even the value of education or the value of providing certain types of healthcare. But a social return on investment is really a way to look at the value of creating impact in a community or societal way.
So it's not necessarily a financial dollar, but you can equate the contribution in a financial way.
Right. Sometimes it
Do you
actually...
have examples?
Yes, so sometimes it is a financial dollar. So sometimes if a person becomes employed and they otherwise would not have been employed, there's a financial dollar in the sense of their wages, but also the money that a government might have otherwise had to invest in that person to keep them at a certain standard of living could actually be reallocated elsewhere. So there are actually real dollars and cents involved in a lot of instances. It's when you start thinking about the value of enabling someone to be more confident, which then triggers something else to happen and triggers something else to happen. The value of that confidence does not have an established market value like a wage would, or a subsidy, or police time, or similar. So when that change has no market value, you would use a proxy to represent it. But many of the changes actually do have market values, and you do represent them in financial terms.
It seems to be a phenomenal and fascinating subject matter to be involved with. So if I'm clear, let's take, for instance, I head a palliative care society, and I'm out trying to raise money, and I get money, whether it be from government, a private donor, whatever. What would some of the things that would go into that equation to try to understand the social impact of that contribution to the palliative care? Obviously, there would be some employment.
Right. Definitely employment. I think the palliative care example is a really interesting one, because what you really want to do is to represent the value of the care that's being provided to the person and perhaps to the family that otherwise would have had a very different experience in the absence of that donor's investment. And so it could be quality of life, it could be ability to be close to family during a very important time. It could be the type of treatment that they receive that they have access to that otherwise they would not have been eligible for. So what you're really trying to do is to demonstrate that there has been a significant difference in the experience of that palliative care patient and potentially their family in the course of them accessing that service.
Would you give back to the donor some sort of, what would the donor get other than he gives, I'm just using hypotheticals,
Sure.
$1 million?
Right.
What would the donor find out about that $1 million?
The donor would be able to understand for every dollar they invested, the amount of social value that was created in return, and also who that value was created for. So sometimes that value is for the client or the patient. Sometimes that value is for their immediate family. In some instances, it could be for their employer. It could be for the government at a federal, provincial, or municipal level. So it's, what my investment has created in terms of value, but also who are the stakeholders that have been impacted as a result of the investment that I've made.
Are you finding investors are amazed at the kinds of returns that they're getting for their dollar investment?
It's very interesting. When we think about what a reasonable return would be in the market, I think that oftentimes when you go into double digits, your risk accelerates, right? And so when social return on investment is initially presented, oftentimes the reaction is, well, I'd like to get the highest ratio possible. In our work, what we see is a solid ratio is about $1 in, $3 to $5 out is an excellent ratio. I think 1 to 1 is often a very good ratio given the complexity that so many of these investments are being made within crime prevention, arts for children and youth, providing facilities for people, for women who find themselves pregnant and have nowhere to go in order to be healthy during their pregnancy and post. I think they're amazed at the kinds of value that they're creating, and I think that...
Probably never thought.
Never thought in those terms, no. And the investor is also, certainly could be a private investor, could be a foundation. Governments are starting to think about the value of public dollars and the ripple effect and around the changes that they're a part of. The Alberta government actually invested $60 million in crime prevention and crime reduction initiatives during the period 2009 to 2014. And so we're just finishing some analysis for them. And for every dollar that was invested, they triggered 50 cents from another organization, some private, some other foundations, et cetera. So there's a huge partnership opportunity there. The collection of that money invested, about $95 million, actually created about $2.80, $3 of social value. 60% of that went to government. So in terms of services that they did not need to provide to people as a result of the investments that were being made through these projects.
That's very significant.
It's interesting, yeah.
Is this fairly new phenomena in Canada? Because I know you did this in Great Britain,
Yep.
Am I correct?
Yes.
So this is fairly new in Canada?
It's fairly new. It's fairly new, but there's quite a lot of interest. I think, at the federal level, Public Health Agency, HRSDC, which is not the right acronym, but the Human Services Department, Treasury Board, there's work being done in, without even thinking about it, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta. So people are really trying to look at the concept of value differently. Because in a social and community context, we often get stuck at the cost conversation without thinking about the value. And yet when we buy shoes or look at a house or think about where, market goods that we want to purchase, we're very comfortable thinking about the value of something which is much more than the cost that it takes to produce it. So,
what sort of preparation would you do to convince a government agency, a private sector donor,
right.
a foundation to participate in this kind of social responsibility?
Well, I would certainly research what that investor's interests are. So I would really want to know what they typically chose to invest in, be it health, education, job creation projects, whatever that might be. I would think about the people that are involved in the conversation. So do they actually have the power to make a decision, or is my job to actually negotiate with them so that they then are empowered to go and negotiate with somebody else?
Like a ball carrier.
It's a whether or not they're a ball carrier or decision maker. I would think about whether or not there were different scenarios that could possibly still be a win at the end result. I mean, maybe they have 7 things that they could invest in, but they choose to invest in one or a part of one in terms of the analysis that might be done. And I guess I would really think about the impact of the potential investment and why they would want to be able to tell a different story to their stakeholders or their key audiences about the role that they have played in enabling that outcome to happen. Those are
So inevitably the conversation will come back to values.
right.
And what you as a donor ascribe to be of value. Mm-hmm. And how's that gone?
How's that gone? Some people are very comfortable with that conversation and others are not. It's very interesting to me how there's 2 different perspectives. Sometimes there's what we would call a social justice perspective. So the values conversation is it's very easy because it's all about making sure that there's a level playing field for people to spring from. Other times it's a conversation about doing the right thing because it's a good thing to do, which that conversation does not necessarily always gravitate towards being able to tell the story of the value that's been created. And I sometimes struggle with that because I feel that conversation can be very difficult to have in terms of doing the right thing when times get tough. And so if you can translate the value of investing into the value that actually comes out at the other end, it's a much more, you are empowering the investor to make an argument for the reason why they are so focused in their investment area, why it makes a difference to them as an investor as well as to the people that they're trying to touch or the stakeholder, be it government or employee or whoever it might be that they're trying to engage through their choice of how they invest in community.
Would the donor, government, private sector, or foundation, what would they get from your corporation in terms of your assessment? I just gave you a check for $1 million, it's going to the palliative care. What would I get back for that?
What would you get back?
Besides a tax receipt that says I can write that off.
Right. So I think it depends how close the donor is to the project. So sometimes what they get is a full analysis and they can pinpoint the value that they've had and who it has been created for. What we prefer to do, to be totally honest, is to make sure that while they do get that, the palliative care unit or residents or the project actually is left with the tools and an understanding of how to use the SROI tools so they can keep telling the story of their value creation over time. That's our preferred approach because so many organizations really know the value of their work intuitively but really stumble to communicate it effectively to external audiences.
I think that's so true.
Yeah.
I think that's so true. They know the value, but they have enormous difficulties in trying to communicate it to potential donors or supporters of the project.
So what we want is to leave them with the tools to do that, not only in retrospect, but also to keep thinking about the value they are planning to create, assess whether or not they achieved that objective, and then communicate the value of what they've achieved.
So what is the in the method?
What's in the method?
What is it? What's the toolbox here?
What's the toolbox? One of the most important pieces is actually being very clear on the scope. So an SROI is a different way of thinking because its origins are in response to the fact that a lot of evaluation around social things is from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, which tends to be, not always, but tends to be, I'm the investor, this is what I invested in, is the result worth it to me, okay? The problem with that is that the voice of the stakeholder or the voice of the community or the voice of the family or the environmental impact is often excluded from the analysis because you're not analyzing what happened on that end, you're analyzing it from the investor's perspective. So the SROI tries to include the voice of the person or the community in whatever form that takes into the expression of the value that's been achieved. Huge first thing is you've got to be able to scope that properly and make good judgment calls, informed judgment calls on what should be in and what should be out. The next thing you've got to do is you have to do an outcomes-based evaluation or an outcomes-based forecast, which is just an evaluation technique that's all about measuring change. Stakeholder consultation is very important. Making sure that as you're telling the story of value creation, the end result really truly does reflect the value that the stakeholder feels that they experienced. So they see themselves at the core of the story that ends up...
So it's pretty authentic.
Very authentic. It's very important for it to be authentic. And then because those steps actually can lead you to a big ripple effect, in an SROI context, there's actually a very significant difference between an outcome and an impact. An outcome is the big impact. You know, the classroom had a higher graduation rate. But then you ask yourself, was there any dead weight? So would anyone have actually graduated without us that would have, been within that vulnerable group? Were there any unintended consequences, either positive or negative, that I need to acknowledge? Do I need to attribute some of the value that's been created to other forces? So I might be working with these kids in class. They might be going to an after-school program. So it wasn't me alone. I need to attribute value to another force when I think about the value of the outcome that's been achieved. And then will there be drop-off over time? And so you really want to be authentic, but you also want to make sure that you don't claim that everything that happened was because of your investment, because typically it's a series of things that contribute to a solid outcome being achieved and enduring over time.
So you're really making a distinction between an outcome and an impact.
Yeah.
What would an impact be again now?
An impact, what I'd like to know is what's my impact. So I'm the investor and I'm investing in this palliative care unit, and were all of the outcomes that were achieved, were they all because of my investment, or were there other pieces of the puzzle that contributed to that outcome? Which means, this is the outcome here, but the value of my investment, the impact of my investment is actually only part of that. I can't take credit for the whole thing in many instances because other forces contributed to that impact.
But it's a remarkable way for an organization to work with its stakeholders, ascertain its value in terms of going forward.
Mm-hmm. I find it quite fascinating, to be honest, because we work with people who are very good at what they do and very, very knowledgeable about the work that they do, but very probably in it so deeply that, as I said before,
don't see the forest for the trees.
Don't see the forest for the trees, and couldn't give you the elevator pitch about what, so what? And so what we try to do is to actually tease out their story so that they see themselves in the story, and then they continue to evaluate their own progress and plan against their progress.
Where did this first start?
There's a gentleman by the name of Jed Emerson. He is still in the social impact, social finance field. Very influential, brilliant man. He was head of an organization called Robertson Enterprise Development Fund, which is in California. It still exists. They help marginalized people, typically quite entrenched in a homeless environment, to change so that they become independent. Anyway, he was the executive director, got really tired of fundraising. He thought, I really want to attract people that want to invest in our ability to do this great work. And so he started thinking if he was going to attract an investor in his ability to achieve a social outcome, what would that investor need to know? Well, they'd need to know about the return on investment and the collection of outcomes that would be associated with that return. And that's how it started in the early 90s, mid-90s.
And you worked with it in the United Kingdom?
I did. I was at London Business School. I set up the Business and Society program there and the Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. And I taught a course. And part of that course was getting these MBA and executive MBA students to think about social return on investment, which I found quite fascinating because these people could do a return on investment calculation in their sleep, back of an envelope, much faster than I could have. And yet, getting them to think about that same frame, but in a social context, was actually one of the hardest things I've ever done. And it wasn't intuitive to them in the way that I expected it to be, because it's really a natural progression of thinking about return on investment. You think about, well, it's interesting. If you bought a house, if I said, I've got a house for you, it's only $100,000.
I'd take it.
You'd take it. No, you wouldn't take it. You'd say, where is it? What's the community like? Where are the grocery stores? We're very comfortable putting value around
those kinds of things.
But putting value around social investments is it's a shift. And I find that fascinating, but it is a real shift for a lot of people.
What's the best article on this social return on investment that you would recommend to our audience?
My favorite one, it's a bit long, so you don't have to read the whole thing, but it's called The Nature of Returns, and it's one of Jed Emerson's earlier papers. And it is just a really good explanation of value is in different forms, and we need to think.
Is it a subjective?
No, it's a policy paper. It's if I'm understanding your question properly,
But on the value, is
right.
it a subjective value or is it an objective valuation of the contribution that is being made?
I think it's in all fairness, it's a blend of the two.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a blend of the two. There also is a guide to SROI, which is on the internet. If you just search SROI guide, the guide is a downloadable PDF that you can get from Social Value International. Yeah.
Tell us, in terms of your experience, the importance of relationships with potential donors, foundations, and governments, as well as the stakeholders that you have to work with in order to achieve your particular result. What have you done on that side of the ledger in terms of relationships?
So that's interesting. I would say that I'm becoming more patient in my relationship development than I think I've always been. I set up Simpact. The word comes from social impact. The whole purpose behind it was just to prove that social things were valuable. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but and I think when I first set up Simpact, I was a little bit less aware of the need to nurture relationships and to build trust, particularly when you're presenting a new concept. What I've found is that it's easier to build a relationship now, probably because there's no more proof points. It's less a conceptual conversation, and now I can actually show what a work would look like in policy areas that range from crime prevention to health to arts programs, so that. But I think I also have learned that, timing is everything, and timing could be the context that the person is operating within, but it also could be timing in terms of the stage of your relationship and how confident the people are yet that you can actually deliver on the objectives that you say you can deliver on. So interestingly enough, today, we went to a meeting to speak to somebody about some evaluation things. Turns out I met her 6 years ago. And in the back of her mind, there was a conversation that she remembered, but it took a while to get to the point internally. And once I realized that, there was the degree of relationship that we could build upon. But it's all about timing. I
have found, just on that, in terms of relationships, I have found that if you're pitching or if you're trying to get stakeholders involved, that the amount of time that it takes is an inordinate amount of time.
Yep.
And I'm not sure of all the reasons as to why, but on the relationship side, people have to feel comfortable with you. They have to feel comfortable that they understand the subject matter, understand its impact, and have some inkling as to where they want to go with it. And something that years ago would take 6 weeks, 8 weeks, I'm finding today in pitching complicated stuff, it's anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. Has that been your experience?
It's interesting because there's one project that we just started that I would say took about 18 months for it to work through the system. The one thing that I thought was quite interesting, though, is there was one particular gentleman who ended up informing the RFP process. So which is a request for proposal. And I decided that when I met him that I just should be as honest as I could, in the sense, not in a dishonest sense, but in the sense of I shouldn't be shy about my expertise. I shouldn't be shy about the things that I thought really mattered in this process. So accreditation is one thing which I think really matters, and you can get around that by getting your process assured. But I sort of said, you need to have someone to deliver this service who is prepared to get a second opinion on the quality of the work at the end of the day. And interestingly enough, the thing which I found so interesting was that at the end of the day, when that RFP actually went public, there was a lot of things which I felt were incredibly important if they were going to get the right vendor. And that to me was really interesting, because I think 2 or 3 years ago I wouldn't have been that blunt. I would have been shyer about saying, if you want a high quality product, these are the things which I think you need to find irregardless of who delivers the service. Whereas maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I would have been more comfortable, maybe timid, asserting myself to say, okay, you know what, actually I know what I'm talking about. You can choose somebody else if you would like. It's got to be a fair and open process. But if you're looking for quality of service, these are the things which, if I were you, I would be looking for in my vendor of choice.
Does your company or others certify people that can do a social return on an investment?
So there aren't enough accredited practitioners in Canada. So if someone wants to become accredited, it's managed out of the UK, and it's an international process.
So how would I qualify?
You would need to take a course.
Of course.
And then you would have to prepare a case study, an SROI, independently, and then present it for peer review, which is a sort of a 2 or 3 step process. So it's
time consuming?
I think it's time consuming if you go for peer review on your first case. What I suggest to people is you practice it a little bit, you get your case assured, do it in a group of 2 or 3 people, become comfortable, and then do it on your own, and then it does not have to be time consuming. So, but you could you can get your work assured as a group through the international process as well. You don't necessarily need to be accredited, but I think it's really important to do one or the other. Yeah.